I'm just wondering if it's possible, and if it's not, can I get a PowerPoint, do you think? Yeah, maybe? Yeah, sorry, I just kind of realized now that I had some good slides that might be valuable, so I don't necessarily need it, but it just sort of plays into the narrative of environmental impacts on wildlife. And in relation to First Nations, there's a really great connectedness between wildlife and First Nations rights. So I just kind of, while he's pulling that up, again, it's not totally imperative, but it has some really great slides in it. It's called the Food Secure one. So just to give you a little bit of a background, I'm a member of the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation. I'm the communications coordinator, so I work directly for Chief Alan Adam, and I've been working in the environmental movement for, I don't know how long. I'd never consider myself an environmentalist, but I consider myself an Indigenous rights activist. And when it comes to regulations and reform to environment and First Nations rights, they go hand in hand for two very reasons. And again, this slide was made for something else, but it has some really good, interesting slides that I sort of wanted to bring forward. The first one is to give you a perspective of what treaty rights really mean. The Athabasca Chipewyan First Nations are signatories to Treaty 8. Now, Treaty 8 encompasses these boundaries, and this is a really old map. It's an old historical map, so it doesn't have all the lines, but basically it goes into British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and the Northwest Territories. So the difference between First Nations rights and Albertan rights or Canadian rights is that we don't abide by the same boundaries as standard Canadians. We signed agreements to basically have a sharing agreement, a trust agreement with the Crown. Treaty 8 was signed in 1899 on the shores of Lake Athabasca. Now, the community of the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation still live and reside in the township of Fort Chipewyan where this treaty was signed. Now, the community of Fort Chipewyan is an isolated community. It's a flying community. There is one road that you can drive in during the winter, and the only other transportation is by river. And that plays a lot when we talk about regulations and who are they actually protecting. And foods, because food and treaty rights go hand in hand. The treaty rights that we signed were to allow us to live our treaty and traditional lifestyles, and that includes our right to food. That includes our right to hunting, fishing, and trapping. And that's where the intersection between policy around the environment and conservation and treaty rights begins to intersect. So what are the foods? Large game such as buffalo, moose, and most importantly, which has become a big part of the public agenda, has been caribou. So some of the ways that the people prepare this meat is, this is actually a picture of my daughter and myself preparing, this is moose meat for traditional drying practices, and this is still practiced today. And the reason I want to give perspective to this is that when we talk about traditional foods and treaty rights, we're not talking about things that we did hundreds of years ago. We're talking about things that we still practice today. We're actually trying to sort of lean away from traditional and move more towards the terminology cultural rights, because they're not traditional, they're not ancient. These are things that we still practice to date. Some other foods that are very important to the people of the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation are fish. And there are a few reasons why fish are so important and abundant. One, you can fish all year round. And it's a major staple because we live on a lake at the mouth of Lake Athabasca and where the river meets the lake, so fish are quite abundant. And again, fish can also be prepared and dried and kept throughout the seasons when fishing isn't as abundant. Other species are waterfowl. So ducks are an important part of our diets. This is my nephew preparing a duck at a culture camp that we had 2 years ago. And just to give you a perspective of the tailings ponds, which are precariously close to the Athabasca River system, and the Athabasca River flowing up to the township of Fort Chipewyan, which sits at the mouth of Lake Athabasca. Now, the reason why I bring up these animals and these species is because we're seeing that all of the traditional food sources of our people are being impacted by development downstream. And the development downstream is supposed to be regulated by both federal and provincial regulations. But the regulations aren't protecting First Nations and Aboriginal rights, particularly for the protection of our foods. So really what we're seeing is a juxtaposition of people's cultural lifestyles and treaty rights, which are ingrained and entrenched in the Canadian Constitution under Section 35. So this goes just beyond the regulations of conservation and management of species and waterways, but this is actually a regulation that should be entrenched and be dealt with on a federal level because it's a constitutional right, versus oil sands or tar sands development. And I really like this bottom picture, which you can't see that well, but on this side is the intact Athabasca Delta system. And then on this side, we have oil sands development. So you really get to see the disparities or the juxtaposition of intact ecosystems versus development, which sits precariously close to the river system, which feeds into Lake Athabasca, where our people get most of our food from. Now, to give you just an understanding of how this has really impacted the people, particularly of ACFN, is that about 15 years ago, the town of Fort Chipewyan was 80% subsistence. 80% subsistence. 80% of our food sources came from the moose, the bison, the caribou, the fish, the ducks, and we also picked berries and medicines from the area. But as we've seen development really take off, as we've seen development really take off in the last 20 years, what we've seen is that a decline in the ability for the people to access traditional foods. Secondarily, we've also seen contamination to our food sources. So just to give you an idea of tar sands, for those that don't know, it's the world's third largest oil deposits after Saudi Arabia, and there are currently it covers about 550 kilometers square in the Athabasca region where they can actually access it through open pit mining. So these are some of the methods of mining. This is open pit mining. It's highly destructive. It completely eradicates the habitat that is necessary for many of the species that the people of the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation survive off of. And here's another photo of one of the open pit mine sites, which also entails open pit tailings ponds, which is basically the waste runoff, which is stored in these open pit lakes that are leaching into groundwater systems and into the Athabasca River as well. So now to get back into the regulations piece, what does that really mean? Well, right now in the province, what we're seeing as far as water allocations and the regulations for water is that we're seeing that oil sands operators are getting the biggest slice of the pie. We're seeing that when it comes to things like habitat enhancement, it's literally the tiniest sliver. But in order to maintain traditional and Aboriginal treaty rights, we have to have intact ecosystems. So habitat enhancement should be a priority given that it's entrenched in our Canadian Constitution. However, that's just not where it's going. Another method of tar sands removal from the ecosystems is through in situ, which the government has deemed sort of environmentally benign. But when you take a look at these systems, what they're actually doing is they're creating pipelines and crisscrosses across the entire region in northern Alberta that are actually fragmenting the habitats of many of the species in the region. And in addition to that, again, water. Water demands for in situ are quite high. So they're not environmentally benign. They have very, very huge impacts on water withdrawals from the Athabasca River system, which again is one of the major sources of transportation to and from the township of Fort Chipewyan. It is the major watering source for many of the animals that we consume, including the fish, the waterfowl, and large game. So when you look at the cumulative Athabasca River water allocations for existing approved and planned oil sands mining operations, you begin to start to see the picture of just how much water is really going to be a major issue in about, I believe this was up until 2020. So now, if we just remove water out of the picture, which is obviously a huge issue, and we just look at land disturbances versus reclamation, which is something the governments are saying to us, don't worry, we're going to be reclaiming this, and you'll be able to continue practicing your cultural rights, and therefore we are respecting your constitutionally protected rights. But when you look at the amount of disturbances versus the amount of their ability to actually reclaim the land, we start to see huge disparities, and the fact that reclamation in many of these projects isn't going to even start for another 20 to 50 years. We're talking about disturbances, planned disturbances of about 2,000 square kilometers by 2020. And those are planned. And then look at what we've done right now. It's zero square kilometers, because right now I think it's 0.02 2 or 5 or something. I'm not really sure what the exact number is, but certified reclaimed. There are places where they are looking at reclamation, but the reclamation is not the same type of landscapes that we saw before. This is not the type of landscape where these species that we are used to be able to hunt and trap and fish are going to be able to survive. So we have to think about how does that impact our constitutionally protected rights? And when we're creating these policies for land disturbances and water allocations, the biggest problem is that First Nations people have been left on the sidelines. From the beginning of development in this province and in this country, what we saw back in the 1950s was the development of the Natural Resource Transfer Agreement, or Act, and that was done without any consultation or input from First Nations communities. This handed over the ability for provinces to control their resources and create their own policies and regulations for how those resources would be dealt with. When that happened, it basically left First Nations completely out of the puzzle, out of the picture, and our rights have began to get really trampled on. And we've seen policy after policy in provinces across the country being created that are further destroying First Nations' abilities to access their traditional lands and continue living their traditional livelihoods, as was agreed to under treaties and is entrenched in the Canadian Constitution. So let's go back and just look at just one species, just to give you an idea. Caribou are a critical species to the people of the Athabasca Chippewa First Nation. They are a culturally relevant species, and they've been hunted for a millennia. So caribou populations have declined by almost 2/3. Estimated populations were 7,000 to 9,000 in the 60s, and now they're more around 3,000 today. If you look at what is the major cause, industrial disturbances in Alberta, we have the highest level of industrial disturbances in Alberta at over 70,000, close to 71,000 square kilometers. So let's look at what that actually means when you look at a map. So the green is where the caribou habitats traditionally are in Alberta. And the squares that are drawn in that map are where the oil sands administration areas are, as have been developed by other policies within the province, such as the Lower Athabasca Regional Plan, or Trelump, which I always get that one wrong, so I'm not even going to try and do that one, or PLAR, which is the Public Lands Administration. I don't remember what the R stands for, I'm so sorry. And then this is the oil sands leases. All these little squares and hatch marks are the leases that have been granted by the Alberta government. Now you look at the industrial disturbances of woodland caribou herds in these areas, and you start to get a better idea. What is the major cause of disturbances to caribou? What is the major cause of the declines in caribou herds? And you start to get a better idea. The biggest problem is now the federal and provincial governments are looking at strategies to address the caribou herds in the province, and they're, again, largely leaving First Nations participation out of the equation, and our rights are, again, being neglected when we're talking about moving forward. So the impacts of industry and the ill-thought-out policies around resource development, particularly with oil sands, has had direct impacts on the people of the Athabasca Chippewa First Nation. Health impacts, elevated rates of cancer. Just 2 weeks ago, a report was released in California that substantiated the work of Dr. Schindler, saying that there were contaminants running into the Athabasca River system, which is now being found in contamination of elevated levels of arsenic and PAHs in the fish. And again, we're also seeing major changes in diets, and that's because we're unable to access our constitutionally protected traditional food sources, and that's leading to increase in diabetes and obesity. And the reason that's the case is because in the town of Fort Chipewyan, there's one grocery store. It's called the Northern, and the Northern has been in the news. They're in all the northern communities in Canada, and they've been in the news because their prices are so exorbitant. It's out of control. A 4-liter, a gallon of milk is like $16, or you could buy a 2-liter of Coke for $3. So when you talk about a family that's living on a fixed income, because many of the people in these communities live on fixed incomes, it's much cheaper to buy things like Coca-Cola and Kraft Dinner than it is to buy a bag of apples and a gallon of milk. So that's changing the diets in a negative way. And so many of these people are having increases in diabetes, and obesity is happening in the area. In addition to that, the cultural losses. The cultural loss, there's an inability for us to access our traditional lands in the way that we used to. A decline in the species that we used to hunt. And these activities are pertinent to the survival of the people, not just the survival of the health of these people, but the survival of the spirit of these people. As Dene Sutlane people, we are intricately connected to the land and to Mother Earth. We view the species as our cousins, our brothers, our sisters, as our relatives. And we lived in harmony with the region for many, many, many years. And now that balance has been upset by industrial development. A few years ago, when I was in Fort Chipewyan talking with one of the elders, she was talking about how just 15 years ago, so I talked to her 5 years ago and she said 15, so about 20 years ago, you used to be able to go out in the spring and they would trap muskrats. I don't know if anyone knows what muskrats are. They're just little water rats, basically. They used to trap muskrats in the spring, and they used to pile hundreds of them on the shore. And it wasn't just about finding that source for food, but it became a community activity that everyone would come down to the shores and help prepare the muskrats, both the muskrat skins and the meat, and it would become a community activity. That is gone. As a part of that being gone, what you see is you sort of have this disenfranchised youth not knowing where to go. They're being pulled in and drawn in by industry, telling them to get jobs and make big money, and they're also having this inability to even access the teachings that their parents and their grandparents have to pass on to them. And again, one thing that needs to be taken into consideration is these rights to hunting, fishing, and trapping are constitutionally protected rights under Section 35, and yet as we develop policy after policy for regulations around Migratory Birds Act, Fisheries Act, emissions, and the applications for individual projects, we are not assessing the adequacy of consultation with First Nations communities and the actual impacts these projects will have on the people. It's being largely left out of the equation. So ACFN is doing a lot of work to try and change this. So some of the things that we're doing, particularly with Caribou, is we developed on your guys' right side, we are the stewards of the land, which is a stewardship model that we're proposing to both the federal and provincial governments, that we need to be looking at caribou management in a more holistic way that incorporates traditional ecological knowledge into the development of policies around conservation and management of species. We've identified, obviously, oil sands or tar sands operations as a major source of disturbances to a traditional food source that should be constitutionally protected under Section 35, Aboriginal and treaty rights. In addition, we've looked at water withdrawals from the Athabasca River system with a report that is called As Long as the River Flows, which looks at traditional ecological knowledge of First Nations usage of the water systems and how we need to be moving forward in a more careful and holistic way of taking into consideration, again, traditional ecological knowledge, the necessities of these river systems as a part of the continuation of cultural survival of many of the people in the north. So, you know, we're not just sitting here taking a step back and moving forward. And in addition, sort of the biggest thing that ACFN has been up to recently is we've been challenging Shell's tar sands proposals for the expansion of the Jack Pine mine, which is going to be about 70 kilometers north of Fort McMurray and would increase production by 100,000 barrels per day, bringing them up to 250,000. And the biggest sore points in it are, one, it would require the mining out of 23 kilometers of the Muskeg River. Now, that plays into the new omnibus bill. Under the new bill C-45, it has sort of gutted out the Navigable Waters Protection Act. It's now the Navigable Protection Act. They've taken waters completely out of it. They've taken most of the river systems in Canada out of it. I believe there are now 93 rivers, 64 lakes, and then the 3 oceans are protected. If your river system no longer falls within those within that list that they've identified, then you can basically forget trying to fight for protection. Now, the Muskeg River, again, is a culturally significant river system. It's a place where people fished. It's a place that people use to navigate to traditional points of hunting, fishing, trapping, and spiritual and cultural practices, which has no longer been protected. Again, when we talk about that omnibus bill, First Nations and Aboriginal rights were obviously not incorporated or thought are really taken into consideration with those developments of those acts. In addition to that, Shell is proposing another project called the Pierre River Mine, which will be 90 kilometers north of Fort McMurray and only about 27 kilometers from the boundary of our reserves. So, you know, some of the things that we're doing is we've currently sued Shell for failure to meet past agreements. These agreements were called impact benefit agreements that were made by previous leadership, and they were to mitigate the impacts of these projects, because one of the failures to include looking at assessing the adequacy of consultation is that First Nations are often left with no other option but to negotiate terms of mitigation with the proponents themselves, in this case Shell. And these are called impact benefit agreements. And these opponents, or these big oil and gas companies, often don't live up to these agreements that they've made, and so our community has sued them. In addition, this needs to be updated, but we've also challenged the Jack Pine Mine project within the joint review panel process, challenging the project on various levels, from the Muskeg River to Caribou disturbances of First Nations and Treaty and Aboriginal rights. And we've also tried to challenge SIA and the joint review panel and the ERCB here in Alberta to include the assessment of the adequacy of consultation of Aboriginal and treaty rights and the Crown's duty to consult. However, the ERCB said, no, we don't want to deal with that. We don't feel we have the jurisdiction. So I just got an email literally 20 minutes before I got here. We took this to the Alberta Court of Appeals, and an answer will be coming out on Monday to whether or not the Alberta Court of Appeals will direct the ERCB to review the adequacy of consultation on this application. This could be groundbreaking and change the way we move forward. However, the Alberta government very slyly also just released this past Friday a new bill called Bill 2, which is the Responsible Energy Development Act, which has a specific clause that says that the new body that will be reviewing applications in the province will not assess the adequacy of consultation. So I don't know what's going to happen given our court case. If there is directives for the ERCB to go back and review that may change Bill 2. I know that our First Nation, along with all of Treaty 8 First Nations, have very huge concerns with the way the regulations and the approvals process is really moving forward, because of the fact that we are compartmentalizing treaty and Aboriginal rights over here while we're developing policies and frameworks that don't encompass or respect our constitutionally entrenched treaty and Aboriginal rights. So thank you very much.